Hey, how's it going? Let's learn about CSV or comma separated value data and what they're all about. Well, in short, what they're all about is storing and sharing information. So it's a way of saving data that can then be shared between applications or between human beings. And we could use devices like USB sticks or the internet probably being the most common situation. CSVs themselves are pretty simple, probably one reason they're so popular. We have values that are separated by commas, and that's pretty much it. The reason I say pretty much, however, is that if I print this for you, I want you to notice these little characters here. We have carriage return characters in our string, and they occur at the line break between each row in our data. And that's kind of important to notice, because even though it has CSV in the name, comma separated value, we're actually not just separating these values here using the commas. Position, for example, is separated by the number 22, not by a comma, but by the carriage return. So that is definitely something we have to take into account when we want to translate this CSV string to something we can work with. The goal here being to store it in a data frame. So the first thing we need to do is we need to split the data by their lines. Fortunately, in Python, there's a handy method called split lines that we're going to use. So when we split our lines, we get a list, and the first element of our list are going to be our column headers, as you can see here, and the rest of the information is the data. So we have this crew member of a starship here called Spock, and then it's Kirk, and then we have Uhura. Now, in order to split these by their commas, we need to do something to each element of our list, right? So the best way of doing that is using a for loop. So let's use a for loop. And in order to get the index of each iteration of our loop, we need to use the enumerate method. Now, in pandas data frames, you want to distinguish column names from their rows, and you want to store both of these sources of information in lists. So what I'm going to do first is say, if the index is equal to 0, which we know to be the first position in our list here, and we know that's the column names, I'm just going to print an output for you guys. It says column names. And because we've printed our column names and we know the rest of the information is the data, we can print data. Great, so now if I run this, we get a nice little output. We get our headline, column names, and we now have our column names. We get the data, and that's the 3 rows of information about crew members of the starship that we're investigating. Next, I'd like to actually store these in lists, and then we're going to use them to create a data frame that contains the data that we want to work with. In the case of the columns, I'm going to remove the headlines because we don't need them anymore. We just want to store the data. We create a list, and it's called columns. And we're going to use a method called split to actually split our first element, these column names here, by these commas. So the Python method split, and it takes a character that we want to use to split our string. We could use any character. You could use boink. You could have a boink separated file, or you could have a period separated file. You don't encounter this though, because using commas is such a strong convention, and for a good reason. It makes it that much easier to share information. So stick to commas if you're creating CSV files. Tabs do occur sometimes, and spaces do occur sometimes. You should be aware, but commas is what we use in comma separated value data. So that's what we're sticking with for now. Next, I want to store the rows, and because there are many rows, I'm going to have to create an array called rows. And rather than just setting it equal to each row, we're going to append the rows to this list. So we get a list of lists that we can send to the data parameter when we create the data frame. Great, and having done this, I'd like to print the columns and print the rows. Let's have a look at our information here. We know that first we're printing the columns, and that seems to have worked. We have crew ID, first name, and position here in a list. And then we have our rows, which is going to be a list of lists, where each element is a list that contains information about the row in our CSV file. And that seems to have worked. We have Spock here, Kirk, and Uhura. So with our columns ready to go, we can create a data frame. First, we need to make sure that we have pandas imported. And then we create a data frame. Where the columns are going to be equal to columns in this case, and the data is going to be equal to our rows. I run this, and there you go. We've now created a data frame using a CSV string. So that is just a really simple use case of using CSV data. It can get a little bit more complicated, but we will discuss that in the future tutorials. Have a good night.